Hello everyone, this is B. Harper from supermussy.com and welcome back to another book review. Today I'm going to be talking about the excellent, the fantastic, the all-round you must fucking read this, Richard Matheson's Hell House. There's really no need to provide a lengthy introduction to Richard Matheson. I mean, almost everything you know of in terms of science fiction, horror and fantasy have somehow come from him. Now, he wasn't the only person to cover these things, but he is one of the more contemporary figures of the genre. As far as I know, he has written quite a few episodes for The Twilight Zone back in its heyday. He's had thousands of published works, like being published in like thousands of languages all around the world. This man has got around like you wouldn't believe. And he's done a couple of like really good other short stories. One of them being one of my favourites, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which was also used in the Twilight Zone movie, as well as the original television series with William Shatner in the role of the really nervous guy who sees a goblin on the plane. But look, my favourite story by him is Hell House. In what is essentially a basic haunted house type of story, he was able to make it into something more. He got primary inspiration from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, but while Shirley Jackson's tale was a lot more suggestive and more, psychological, Matheson's Hell House is a lot more visceral. It's incredibly physical in how it's written and how the characters are affected. So you have a bunch of people led by a doctor, and some of them are psychic investigators. Like you have a spiritual medium, you have somebody who can do a seance. You have like a cross-section of people who have particular sensitivity to the spiritual realm, and you also have one who's a skeptic. And they go into a house that was once owned by a very mysterious and, by quite a few accounts, tyrannical individual known as Emeric Belasco. And I actually spoke about Emeric Belasco in one of my Villainlicious articles, and I'll link you down here just to give you more of an insight about this man. He's quite a character. But when these people go into this house, they are almost instantly affected by the forces that live in it. There's a character, Florence Tanner. She's the spiritual medium, and she's very sort of, flowy and very in touch with the what's beyond the veil. Like, she has a very open demeanor about her, and she's also incredibly beautiful, apparently. And the forces in the house take distinct sort of interest in her. So she ends up somewhat being a bit of a conduit for the spirits to communicate through. But let's face it, Hell House is a scary book. And although, there is the argument of saying, sometimes less is more when it comes to these things, the way Richard Matheson writes, more is great. It's, for lack of a better term, he isn't afraid to pull his punches, or rather, he isn't afraid to, just sock you right in the face. That there's no holding back. Like when he gets going with these forces that are living inside this cursed house, it is a shitstorm. It's a really great book. I'm sorry, I just got a really itchy nose right now. And yeah, it's the character of Emeric Belasco. I won't go too far into detail, but what he did in that house is pretty much what gives Hell House its name in the title. What he did was that he held these almost, Salo, 120 days of Sodom type parties. You had, whoring, drinking, drug use, organized, orgies and fights and that sort of stuff. But as time went on, and as Belasco himself started to become, more perverted and far more, megalomaniacal, everybody in that house degraded into something less than human. they resorted to some really filthy stuff, and I'm talking about, you know, incest, inbreeding, you know, accounts of demonic possession, that sort of stuff, and you know, wanton violence. It's just, that's the thing about the book, like you really need to read it in order to get a full scope of what's going on here. And in Matheson's very distinctive prose, like, he lets you know exactly what's happened. There is no sort of halfway with this book. It pretty much throws everything as well as the kitchen sink into it. It's really, really good. But I've heard some common criticisms about this book. That is being the fact that it does rely more on the sensationalistic approach. That is to say, it doesn't hold back on violence or sexual content, you know, instances of sexual assault made on the female characters. But I feel that is what gives the book its punch. And yes, I completely understand you thinking, you know, that I don't understand horror. Well, how dare you say that? but yeah, the idea that, you know, the scary stuff is best left up to the imagination is completely valid, and I completely, you know, understand and abide by that. But if you're going to tell a story like this, you've got to commit to it. You can't afford to go in half-cocked. And that's what Matheson does. He is very, very fearless in his approach. He knows he's going to shock you. He knows that the stuff he writes about the Belasco house and the perverted souls who live within it, that is going to make you raise your eyebrows and go, whoa. Yeah, there's so much to unpack in this novel. It's one of those books that is immortal. It has basically influenced quite a few of the contemporary authors we have around today. Stephen King and Clive Barker, for example, they all have their distinctive styles. I'm not saying that Stephen King has stolen from Richard Matheson or Clive Barker's career has been a lie at all. You know, they have their own strengths and they've done a lot of fantastic work over the years. But they have admitted themselves that, you know, some of which they write, you know, owes itself back to Richard Matheson. And Hell House is a shining example of all this. I actually left my copy of the book back at home, otherwise I probably, you know, would have flicked through it and read you a couple of the really sort of, you know, hardcore type of passages. But please take my word for it. Richard Matheson's Hell House is amazing. It is a must-read. It will disgust, it will shock, it will thrill you to the core. And that is what Richard Matheson does. He had such a rich imagination, and somehow he knew how to put it on paper. And it is so difficult for most writers to do that. They need to chip away and work at it before they finally come with a result. But Matheson's imagination and the way he utilised his creative talents was almost unnatural. And, you know, I didn't know the guy, of course, and for all I know, he probably spent hours sitting up one night just to, you know, write one page. But in the end, when you see that sort of stuff on paper, and if it is able to inspire you to write your own work, that's when you know an author is something else. And that's what Richard Matheson has done. That is what he did with all the works he's written. Now, some of his works may not necessarily have the same punch as others, but you can't keep a great brain down. And Hell House is an accumulation of that. It is a whole wealth, a goldmine of horror being used correctly, like horror done in a more excessive and visceral way. Now, actually, before I conclude this video, I want to say that I have read both of Hell House and Shelley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and although they do have quite a lot in common, thanks to Matheson's adaptation of the material, they still are very separate entities, and I don't feel that it serves either book well by comparing them. Shirley Jackson was in her own state of mind when she wrote that book. It was all rather psychological rather than physical. But Matheson, you know, he's like the Steven Spielberg when it comes to horror / sci-fi and fantasy. He isn't afraid of going big and going great. And yeah, Both books are well worth reading, in my opinion. But if you are after something that packs a significant physical punch that just makes you go, ugh, like when you read it, Hell House has that. So I give Richard Matheson's Hell House a 5 out of 5. Read it. Okay, everybody, I'll see you later, and you take care of yourselves and each other. Bye-bye.